Vikings are often portrayed as fierce warrior savages that pillaged and plundered through Europe, that were mostly undefeated. Well, according to recent research, most of these views are wrong, or not really distinctive for the Vikings. So basically, a lot of information is wrong on what seems to be common knowledge about the Vikings. And I'm not talking about superficial stuff like horned helmets here. First off, Vikings are not an ethnicity. Being a Viking is, or better was, an occupation, like being a heavy metal musician or a university professor. The term is derived from the Old Norse word Viking, which means basically raider or pirate. Yet the term is also used more openly even among scholars. To quote the historian Gareth Williams, although trading, crafts, seafaring and settlement and many other aspects of Viking society may be equally important, it is the raiding which gives us the concept of a Viking age. So let's take a look at the common myths. First off, these myths and portrayals were influenced by various factors. Since the Vikings plundered monasteries and those were the leading centers of literacy in the Middle Ages, history in this case was written mostly by the losers. In contrast, the Viking culture was mostly a non-literate culture. They had an alphabet but only produced a very limited amount of written documents, and those that survived were usually created after Christianity had already a major influence on their culture. As if those monks were not bad enough, there were the usual misinterpretations and also glorifications later. And as we all know, if you cross a husky with a rat often enough, you get a chihuahua. Anyway, let's combine some common views and myths about the Vikings into one statement. Vikings were fierce, undefeated and brutal warriors that lusted for battle, who pillaged and plundered through the peaceful Christian coastal areas of Western Europe like a gang of hoodlums and committed unspeakable atrocities. Now, let's take some time to examine various parts of this little sentence. Pillaged and plundered through the peaceful Christian coastal areas of Western Europe. Did the Vikings pillage and plundered through coastal areas? Yes, they did, and since they were overachievers, they did even more. They also attacked mostly landlocked targets like Paris by using their superior ships that had a great deal of carrying capacity and could also travel in relatively shallow water. Yet these areas were definitely not peaceful. There was a regular warfare between the many kingdoms throughout that era. Nor were the Vikings the only ones that attacked Christian monasteries or churches. Attacks from Christians weren't unknown at that time. This also brings us to the next part, the brutality and atrocities. Brutal warriors that lusted for battle and committed unspeakable atrocities. One brutality cited is the so-called blood eagle, which allegedly was the cutting up of ribs and pulling out the lungs of the victim. But there are very few accounts of it, and those do not appear in contemporary sources. Hence many scholars argue that it was a literary invention, misinterpretation or exaggeration. But this doesn't mean that the Vikings were a bunch of nice guys that politely knocked on your door and asked if they can talk to you about the savior of mankind for the thunder god. But historical behavior needs always to be taken into context. Thus brutality in the Middle Ages can't be measured by modern standards. But what we know, what was common at that era, there's little indication that the Vikings were much more brutal than the Christians at that time. Which brings us to the next part, like a gang of hoodlums. Although Vikings are usually portrayed as fierce warriors, they are also often portrayed more like a gang than an organized war party or military force. Yet there are many indications that they were well organized. They had a strategy which had a strong focus on mobility, logistics and recon that allowed them to attack targets by surprise and leave before the enemy could react. Furthermore, it is noted that they avoided battle unless they were confident to win. There's a technical term for this. It is called smart. Mobility was a crucial part of Viking raiding campaigns. They achieved this by using their ships, but also horses. These horses were mainly used for transport and usually not during combat. Thus the Vikings used mounted infantry and not cavalry. It is known that the Vikings sometimes attacked from land and sea together. for instance at Exeter in 876. On the logistical side, the Vikings were quite sophisticated as well. The original raids were small and seasonal, but later on they performed large-scale raids and even performed them during winter. Considering that land wars by major kingdoms in that era were usually not conducted during winter, this should give you an indication on how well the Vikings were able to manage their supplies. They achieved this feat by taking over monasteries, towns and other places early in winter, thus these places were already filled with supplies. Additionally, for the invaded kingdom it was difficult to raise and supply an army during that time of the year, which made counterattacks very unlikely. William's view on this is particularly interesting. When even major kingdoms struggled to maintain permanent field armies, the fact that the Vikings managed to campaign for years on end, often in hostile territory, is perhaps a more impressive achievement than any success they may have enjoyed on the battlefield. Which means that any portrayal of the Vikings as a disorganized force that acted without thought or careful planning is even less valid as my claim to the crown of Prussia. Which brings us to the final part of the statement. Vikings were fierce, undefeated and brutal warriors that lusted for battle. It is without question that the Vikings were formidable foes, especially since we know that they were smart and well organized, which is a crucial element for conducting effective military operations. Nevertheless, they also suffered notable defeats, besides the notable victories, and thus were far from undefeated. To conclude, let's revise what is left of our original myth sentence. Vikings were fierce warriors that pillaged and plundered through coastal areas of Western Europe. And the reality was probably a bit closer to the following statement. Vikings were fierce and organized warriors that attacked selected targets in coastal areas and near large rivers due to superior strategic mobility. Their grasp of logistics allowed them to perform raids even during winter, which was very uncommon at that time, unlike the raids itself, and they committed violence, which were common occurrences in that time period, even among Christian kingdoms. So since we tackled the myths, one question remains: how could the Vikings be stopped from raiding? As mentioned before, Viking raids relied heavily on mobility and supplies. Thus denying them both was a viable defensive measure. This was achieved by building fortified bridges that denied them access to the various rivers that were vital for their raids. Additionally, fortified towns on the coast allowed the defenders to hold out longer and also serve as a supply base for defending armies. And finally, it should be noted that Viking battle techniques and weapons were actually quite similar to that of their foes. The most distinctive feature of the Vikings was the emphasis of ships, strategic mobility and logistics, which allowed them to outmaneuver the enemies before they could properly react. Thus the main difference between Viking warfare and that of their foes was on a strategic, not tactical level. And we all know it is more comforting for the ego to state that one was overwhelmed by brutality rather than to admit that one was outsmarted by so-called savages. Now if you're interested in Vikings, I have two recommendations for you. First, the book Viking World from 2011 with more than 700 pages. It is full of scholarly articles about everything concerning the Vikings. I only read a few articles, but those were excellent and full of information and served me well for this video. And second, an album trilogy from the German heavy metal band Rebellion, which contains some of my favorite songs, most notably Ruling the Waves and God of Thunder. As always, you can find all the links in the description. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. And see you next time.